They boarded quietly, holding first-class tickets and a gift for their grandmother. But minutes later, the flight attendant was standing over them, raising her voice, questioning their place, and demanding they move to the back. She didn't know who they were. She didn't care. But when the boy calmly said just 5 words, "We're not moving. Call the captain," everything changed. And before the wheels ever left the ground, the plane was grounded, and her career was over. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new one. The airport was busy, loud, and full of life. People rushed in every direction, dragging bags, checking screens, hugging loved ones. In the middle of all that noise, 2 siblings stood calmly at the gate. The older brother, Brandon, looked around, focused and alert, while his younger sister, Ava, leaned against her carry-on, holding a small box wrapped in gold paper. It was a gift for their grandmother's birthday. They were dressed neat and quiet, both holding first-class boarding passes in hand. When the announcement called their group, they walked forward together without a word. The gate agent scanned their tickets and gave them a polite smile. "Enjoy your flight," he said. They nodded and entered the jet bridge, stepping onto the plane without expecting anything unusual. Inside, the first-class cabin was bright and peaceful. Leather seats, soft lighting, and the quiet hum of conversations filled the space. Some passengers had already taken their seats, reading newspapers or sipping orange juice. Brandon and Ava moved to row 2, placed their small bags in the overhead bin, and sat down. Brandon looked out the window, while Ava placed the gift box carefully under the seat. It felt like a normal trip, like any other flight. But then, a voice cut through the calm. "Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right place?" Brandon turned. A tall flight attendant named Heather stood over them. Her face was stiff, her tone sharp. "These seats are for first-class passengers," she added. Brandon held up his ticket. "We are in first class," he said politely. Heather didn't take the ticket. She just looked them up and down. "Can I see your boarding passes, please?" she asked again, firmer now. He handed her both tickets. She stared at them for a moment. The seat numbers matched perfectly, but her expression didn't change. She gave the tickets back without a smile. "All right, just checking," she said, and walked away. Brandon looked over at Ava. Neither of them said anything, but Ava's expression had changed. Her hands rested tight around the gift box now, her eyes unsure. Minutes passed. Passengers kept boarding. The overhead bins filled. The engines started to hum softly under the floor. Everything was moving toward takeoff, until Heather returned. This time, she didn't ask questions. She didn't check tickets. She simply stood in front of them and said, "I'm going to need you to move to the back." Brandon looked up again, confused. "Why?" he asked. "We already showed our passes." Heather crossed her arms. "There's been a change," she said. "Those seats are now needed for someone else." She didn't explain who. She didn't explain why. "Please come with me." Ava leaned toward her brother, her voice low. "We didn't do anything wrong." Brandon nodded, then looked back at Heather. "We're not moving unless the captain tells us to," he said calmly. That answer made Heather's face harden. "If you won't move," she snapped, "I'll call security." Her voice was louder now. Passengers around them turned to look. The cabin, once quiet and calm, began to fill with whispers. Ava's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. She reached down and pulled out her phone. Her fingers typed something fast. Brandon didn't stop her, he just sat still, his face tight with patience. Heather, now clearly upset, turned away in a hurry, her footsteps heavy on the carpet. She didn't realize it yet, but she had just made the biggest mistake of her career, and the plane, still waiting at the gate, was not going anywhere. Heather marched quickly toward the front of the plane, her heels hitting the floor with force. Her jaw was tight, her cheeks flushed. She muttered under her breath as she approached the cabin phone, ignoring the looks from other passengers. Some turned their heads as she passed, while others whispered behind their hands. They had seen the confrontation. They had heard the raised voice, but like most people, they said nothing aloud. Back in row 2, Brandon sat still, his arms crossed. He kept his eyes on the aisle, waiting. Ava leaned slightly into him, her hand still trembling around her phone. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked quietly. Brandon gave her a single nod. "It will." Heather picked up the intercom and pressed the button to speak with the cockpit. Her voice was low and controlled. "Captain, we have a problem in first class. 2 passengers are refusing to move. I need ground security to remove them before takeoff." There was a pause. Then the captain's voice crackled back. "Name of the passengers?" Heather's lips tightened. "Brandon and Ava Carter," she replied. The intercom went silent. Then a new voice came through. It wasn't the captain. It was deeper, calmer, and far more serious. "This is Richard Carter. Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Heather froze. For a second, she thought she had misheard. Her hand hovered over the phone. Her face lost all color. Slowly, she glanced back down the aisle. Brandon was watching her. So was Ava. Heather took a shaky breath. "See Carter?" she asked, almost to herself. "Yes," the voice replied. "Richard Carter, you just attempted to remove my niece and nephew from their assigned seats. Do you have an explanation?" Passengers nearby began to shift in their seats. Some were clearly confused. Others were shocked. A man a few rows back leaned forward, whispering to his wife. "Did he say Carter, as in the Richard Carter?" Heather swallowed hard. She knew that name. Everyone in the airline did. Richard Carter wasn't just another customer. He was one of the founding executives of the entire company. Not just a board member, but a man with power, real power. The kind that didn't need to shout to make people listen. She backed away from the intercom, her hand trembling slightly. Eyes all over the cabin were now locked on her. The tension that had started with a few whispered words was now heavy in the air. And still, Brandon and Ava hadn't moved. They hadn't argued, hadn't raised their voices. All it took was one message, one call. And now the plane was no longer preparing for takeoff. It was preparing for something else entirely. Heather stood frozen near the intercom, her thoughts spinning. Her throat was dry, her palms were sweating. She had made a mistake, an enormous one, and now it was playing out in front of a full first-class cabin. She had expected resistance, maybe even a complaint. But not this. Not him. She turned toward the front of the plane, hoping to escape the stairs burning into her back. But she didn't get far. The cockpit door opened. Captain Lawrence, a seasoned pilot in his late 50s with silver streaks in his hair, stepped out slowly. His face was calm, unreadable. His presence alone silenced the front half of the cabin. He walked forward with steady steps and stopped beside Heather. "You told me there was a seating issue," he said quietly. "You didn't tell me it involved the Carter family." Heather opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her voice, always sharp and firm, now refused to work. The captain didn't wait for her to respond. He turned his attention toward Brandon and Ava. "I'm very sorry for the disturbance," he said politely. "Is everything all right?" Brandon gave a small nod. "We're fine, Captain." "Thank you," Lawrence nodded in return, then looked at Heather. His eyes were still calm, but his tone had shifted. "Miss Thompson, return to the galley. I'll speak to you privately in a moment." Heather hesitated, but the look in his eyes left no room for questions. She turned and walked quickly to the back, her face pale. Passengers followed her with their eyes. Some whispered again, this time louder. "She's in real trouble," someone said. "You don't mess with the Carter family." Back in row 2, Ava leaned closer to Brandon. Her voice was a whisper. "Do you think she knows who Uncle Richard really is?" Brandon shook his head slowly. "Not until now." Ava looked around. The air felt thick with attention. Every eye seemed to shift toward them now, but the energy had changed. Earlier it was judgment, confusion. Now it was quiet respect, and a little fear. In the rear of the cabin, Heather tried to steady her breath. She leaned against the storage compartment, gripping its edge tightly. She couldn't stop replaying the moment Richard's voice came through the intercom. It had been calm, steady, but deadly serious. It was a voice she had heard only once before, in a training video about corporate structure. Back then, she thought he was just a name, a face in a company booklet. Now that face had just spoken to her directly, and she had no idea what he was going to do next. The captain re-entered the cockpit, but the tension didn't leave the cabin. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, but it felt louder than anything else. Passengers continued to whisper. Some pulled out their phones, pretending to scroll, though their ears were clearly tuned in. No one had gone back to their books or movies. Everyone was watching and waiting. Heather stayed near the galley, hands clenched into fists. Her mouth was dry, her thoughts scrambled. She had worked hard to climb the ladder, 12 years in the airline, 3 promotions, not a single write-up. She had always kept control of her flights, her crew, her cabin. But now, just a few words spoken over the intercom had turned everything upside down. She looked toward the front of the plane. Brandon and Ava were still in their seats, still calm. Ava looked out the window. Brandon sat upright, unmoved. Their silence was louder than any argument. The cockpit intercom buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a crew call. It was an announcement. A new voice came through, sharp and steady. "This is Richard Carter. Until further notice, this flight is delayed. All ground operations have been contacted. The crew member responsible for the incident is to be immediately removed from active duty." Passengers gasped. Some turned to each other in shock. A few started recording, pretending to angle their phones naturally, but everyone knew what they were doing. Heather's knees weakened. She looked around, heart pounding. She had never heard a message like that come through mid-boarding. Never. She moved to the jump seat in the back, but didn't sit. She stood, trying to think, to breathe, to fix it somehow. But there was nothing to fix. Within seconds, the cabin phone rang. One of the junior crew members picked it up and turned toward Heather. "The captain wants to see you." Heather walked slowly to the cockpit. Every step down that aisle felt longer than the last. Every face she passed was watching her now. Not with confusion, but with expectation. They knew she was in trouble. They could feel it. She reached the door and stepped inside. Captain Lawrence sat with his arms crossed. On the screen in front of him was the airline's regional operations manager, his expression hard. He didn't greet her. He didn't smile. "Miss Thompson," he said, "please sit." She lowered herself into the small fold-down chair, her hands shaking. The captain looked at her once, then back at the screen. The man continued, "You've just been named in a report filed directly by Richard Carter. He claims you verbally harassed and attempted to forcibly relocate 2 first-class passengers, his niece and nephew, without cause." Heather opened her mouth. "I didn't know who they were." "That's the problem," the man cut in. "You didn't need to know. Their tickets were valid. Your behavior was not." Heather's words caught in her throat. She could feel the ground slipping from beneath her. The man's voice turned cold. "Effective immediately. You are suspended from active duty. You will not participate in debriefing. You will be escorted to our admin office upon landing." Heather blinked. "Suspended?" Captain Lawrence's face remained unreadable. He added quietly, "If you choose not to comply, security will meet us before we even reach the gate." Heather's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're serious?" The man on the screen didn't blink. "Miss Thompson, Mr. Carter doesn't make suggestions. He gives orders." And in that moment, Heather realized something terrifying. She wasn't just being suspended. She was being erased. Heather walked out of the cockpit with her shoulders stiff and her face pale. She didn't look at anyone as she made her way back down the aisle, but the silence that followed her said it all. The hum of quiet conversation had died. Passengers had gone still. She was no longer a crew member commanding the cabin. She was now the center of a slow, quiet downfall, and she felt every eye on her like heat. She reached the back of the plane, finally sitting in the crew jump seat near the galley. Her hands trembled as she tried to adjust her uniform, as if straightening her appearance would somehow fix what had happened. But the fabric of control she once wrapped herself in had already slipped away. She stared straight ahead, breathing shallow, the captain's words still echoing in her mind. "If you refuse, security will meet us before we even reach the gate." In the front, Brandon sat in silence. He hadn't spoken since the announcement. Ava, still holding the gold-wrapped box on her lap, glanced sideways at him. "Do you think she's really getting removed?" she asked under her breath. Brandon nodded slightly, his eyes calm. Uncle Richard doesn't call the cockpit just to scare people. Ava let out a small breath, still holding back the sting of what happened earlier. "She embarrassed us, in front of everyone." Brandon's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. "And now everyone is watching her." Across the aisle, a middle-aged man leaned toward them. "Hey," he said gently. "I just wanted to say, I saw everything. You both handled it really well. Better than most adults I know." Brandon gave him a polite nod. "Thank you." The man shook his head. People like her, thinking they can treat anyone any way they want. Glad someone finally said no. Ava managed a small smile, but it didn't last long. In the rear of the plane, Heather buried her face in her hands for a moment. Her breath came sharp and shallow. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. Not the kind that stripped you down in front of 100 strangers. The kind that followed your name through every airline system. She had worked so hard to build her reputation, to move up through the ranks. And now, just like that, she was being told her career could be over before the plane even landed. A soft knock came at the back galley wall. Another flight attendant, Claire, one of the new hires, stood there, looking unsure. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Heather looked up with hollow eyes. "Do I look okay?" Claire hesitated, then took a small step forward. I didn't expect it to go this far. I don't think anyone did." Heather let out a bitter breath. They made one phone call, one. Claire nodded slowly. Because they didn't have to scream. They didn't argue. They just waited. Heather looked away. She hated that the girl was right. She hated that it had all started with a simple assumption. Two well-dressed teenagers sitting in first class. Something about it had irritated her, and instead of checking herself, she acted like she always had, like she was in charge, like no one could challenge her, like she couldn't be wrong. But she had been wrong, and Richard Carter had made sure she wouldn't forget it. From the front of the plane, another announcement rang out. This time, it was the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be holding on the runway for a few more minutes. Thank you for your patience. Please remain seated." Passengers knew the delay wasn't weather, or traffic, or systems. It was her, and she felt it in the way people turned toward the back, in the way a few passengers in business class stood slightly, trying to get a better view of her seat, in the quiet, knowing eyes of the crew members who walked past her without a word. Heather gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. The plane hadn't taken off yet, but for her, the fall had already begun. The plane remained still on the runway, the engines humming quietly beneath the silence that had settled over the cabin. The captain's voice no longer played through the speakers, but no one had returned to normal. Not a single passenger had resumed reading or watching a movie. The tension inside that aircraft had shifted from curiosity to something heavier, something cold and final. They all knew something unusual was happening, and they all knew who it was about. Heather sat in the rear jump seat like a statue, her spine stiff against the wall, hands resting flat on her thighs to hide their trembling. Her thoughts spun wildly, grasping for explanations, for excuses, for someone to blame. But every time she tried to reason her way out, she circled back to the same moment, when she had looked at Brandon and Ava and decided they didn't belong in those seats. Not because of their tickets, but because of how they looked. Because of a snap judgment she didn't even question. And now, her entire career was being unraveled by a calm voice on a phone. In the front, Ava rested her head on Brandon's shoulder. She had stopped crying a while ago, but her face was still red, her eyes tired. "I just wanted to fly. I was excited. I've never been in first class before," she whispered. "I know," Brandon said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Ava nodded, but her voice broke slightly. "Why did she hate us?" Brandon paused for a long second, then said, Some people don't need a reason. They just think they're better. From the seat across the aisle, a woman turned toward them. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with kind eyes and gray hair tucked behind her ears. "I saw the whole thing," she said gently. "You two didn't deserve that. And she knew it, even before your uncle called." Ava gave her a grateful look. "Thank you." The woman smiled. "And for what it's worth, I've flown with this airline for 20 years. That voice on the intercom, that's not just some rich executive. That man built this company." Brandon already knew that, but hearing it from a stranger only made it feel more real. Back in the galley, Heather shifted her legs, trying to appear calm, but her mind was slipping. She had been with this airline since she was 23. She had worked overnight flights, red-eyes, emergencies in bad weather. She had handled medical incidents, customer complaints, unruly passengers. She had always come out on top because she followed the rules, enforced policies, and demanded respect. But none of that mattered now, because respect wasn't something you could demand. And in one moment she had lost it all. The flight attendant from earlier, Claire, returned with a paper in hand. She approached slowly, hesitating. "This just came through from operations," she said. Heather took it with a shaking hand. It was a printed copy of a message from airline headquarters. Her eyes locked onto the first line. "Miss Heather Thompson is to be removed from duty upon arrival and escorted directly to administration for termination review." She couldn't breathe for a second. It wasn't just suspension. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a full removal. Her mouth went dry as she read the rest. She had hoped for a formal meeting, a private conversation, maybe even a chance to explain. But it was already too late. Richard Carter had already made the decision. And from the tone of the message, it was clear. The company was standing behind him completely. Claire cleared her throat quietly. "They also requested your badge and security key be turned in before we land." Heather looked up, stunned. "Before we land?" Claire nodded. "They don't want you stepping off the plane in uniform." The humiliation sank deeper. She had never even heard of that happening before, not in all her years, not even for serious infractions. And she knew exactly what it meant. They weren't just letting her go, they were making an example out of her. Slowly, she reached up and unclipped her badge. Her name, printed in gold letters, stared back at her. Heather Thompson, Senior Cabin Supervisor. She had worn that badge with pride. She had fought for it. She had believed it gave her authority, gave her protection. But now it was just plastic. She handed it to Claire, who took it silently and stepped back. Heather sat back in the jump seat, now bare, no badge, no rank. And for the first time in her life, she realized that the power she thought she held had never really belonged to her. The aircraft sat unmoving, waiting for clearance. But inside the cabin, everything had already shifted. Power, once carried by a crisp uniform and an assertive voice, now belonged to two young passengers seated quietly near the front. Brandon kept his posture steady, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, while Ava leaned back in her seat, still clutching the gift box in her lap. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was focused, controlled. They didn't smile. They didn't gloat. They just waited. Passengers had stopped pretending to look away. A row behind them, a businessman pulled out his phone and typed rapidly, probably sending a message about what was happening. The woman with the gray hair quietly observed, as if waiting for the next chapter to unfold. No one had gone back to their coffee or magazines. Everyone was fully aware that they were part of something unusual, something that wouldn't just end when the plane took off. At the back of the plane, Heather sat like a ghost in the jump seat. She stared at the floor, legs stiff, fingers still tingling from the badge she had just surrendered. Without it, she felt smaller, as if even the space around her had pulled back, disowning her. She glanced down at her uniform, now feeling more like a costume than a sign of authority. For the first time in her career, she felt like she didn't belong. She thought about how it had started. The boarding passes had been fine, she had checked them twice, and yet, something inside her had still pushed her to challenge those kids. Two black teenagers dressed nicely sitting in first class. She couldn't even explain to herself why it bothered her. It wasn't in the handbook. It wasn't in her training. But it had felt wrong to her, and so she acted. Not on facts, not on policy, but on something uglier. Something she had never been forced to confront. Until now. The memory of Ava's face, tight with emotion, returned to her. That little girl hadn't even raised her voice. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't begged. She had just taken out her phone and sent one text. Heather closed her eyes, a cold shiver running through her. She had watched passengers yell and scream on planes for years. She had called security before, removed people from flights. She had always felt like she was the one in control. But these two, they hadn't needed to shout. They hadn't needed to demand anything. They had someone more powerful than anyone on that aircraft. And they knew it. The intercom crackled again, snapping Heather out of her thoughts. Captain Lawrence's voice came through, steady and clear. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff. We've been cleared to proceed. Thank you, passengers, for your patience." But it wasn't just the typical instruction. The way he said it, measured and low, it sounded like a warning. Heather didn't move. She couldn't. The announcement didn't apply to her anymore. She wasn't part of the crew being addressed. She was no longer one of them. Claire passed by on her way to secure the front galley. As she reached the middle of the cabin, she paused and leaned slightly toward Brandon and Ava. Her voice was quiet, professional, but different. Softer than it had been when she served other passengers. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" she asked. Ava looked up for a second, then shook her head politely. Brandon said nothing. Claire gave a small nod and stepped away. The message was clear. Respect had found its direction, and the crew knew exactly who deserved it now. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, Heather felt the vibration through the seat, but it didn't feel the same as before. It felt distant, like she was a passenger now, not a part of the system. And in a way, she was. A passenger riding to the end of her own story. As the aircraft lifted gently off the ground, the lights dimmed and the cabin tilted into the sky. Heather sat in the back, silent, invisible, stripped of her role, stripped of her pride. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same moment, her hand reaching out, telling those two kids they didn't belong. And now, the truth of it burned through her. She was the one who didn't belong. Not anymore. The plane cut through the sky, smooth and steady, but inside the cabin the air felt dense with quiet reflection. The soft buzz of the overhead lights mixed with the occasional sound of seatbelt clicks and tray tables being adjusted. But no one spoke much. Not like they usually did. There was no laughter, no small talk, no casual conversations. The energy had shifted from awkward curiosity to quiet discomfort. Passengers were processing what they had just witnessed. Some with guilt, some with discomfort, and others with a growing awareness of the injustice they had nearly ignored. Ava sat back in her seat, the gold-wrapped box still on her lap, untouched. Her fingers traced the edge of the ribbon slowly, as if grounding herself with something that still felt normal. She didn't say much, but her eyes scanned the rows ahead of her, looking at the backs of heads, the shoulders of people who had watched her be spoken to like a problem, like an inconvenience. Not a single one of them had said anything while it was happening, and now she could feel their silence, thick like fog. Brandon rested his arm on the armrest, staring straight ahead. He wasn't angry, not visibly, but he wasn't calm either. His stillness came from control, not peace. He had grown used to situations like this, maybe not always so public or dramatic, but always present. The extra glance, the questions, the subtle suspicion. Only this time Heather had gone too far, and had gone too far in front of too many people. From the galley near the front, Claire approached again. She offered snacks, water, and apologies in her tone, even if she didn't say the words directly. "Please let me know if you need anything," she said softly, placing 2 bottles of water on their tray without waiting for a reply. Ava looked at the water, then up at her. "Are we still landing on time?" Claire nodded. Yes, but when we land, you may see some people at the gate. Brandon turned his head. What kind of people? Claire hesitated. Corporate. From the top. Your uncle. He's not just waiting. He's bringing people with him. Ava blinked. Why? Claire swallowed. Because he's not treating this like a crew error. He's treating it like a company-wide problem, a public one. Brandon nodded slowly. He wants people to see the consequences. Claire looked at them both for a second longer, then stepped away. Back in the rear of the plane, Heather stared at the galley wall as if it were a blank screen playing back her mistakes. The jump seat felt harder now, more exposed. Her uniform felt heavier, like every thread was wrapped in shame. She could still hear the whispers even if no one was speaking. She could still feel the judgment, even if no one looked directly at her. She tried to imagine what would happen when the plane touched down. Would someone meet her right at the door? Would she be escorted out in front of everyone? Would they take her ID badge in front of passengers? In front of Ava and Brandon? She hated how much it mattered to her now. She had always told herself she didn't care what passengers thought, that her job was to manage the cabin, not make friends. But now, with her reputation hanging by a thread, she realized how much of it had been built on fear, not respect. And fear doesn't protect you when the people above you stop defending you. She stared at the safety card tucked into the seat back nearby, not reading it, just needing something to look at. That wasn't a face full of blame. Her mind flashed back again, standing over those two kids, demanding their tickets, speaking sharply, like she had caught them doing something wrong. She hadn't cared how it looked. She hadn't cared if it hurt them. She just assumed she was right. That assumption had ended everything. She thought of how Ava had looked at her. No yelling, no tears, just quiet shock and disbelief. And how Brandon hadn't raised his voice once, just said he wasn't moving unless the captain told him. That kind of self-control didn't come easy, especially for someone being humiliated in front of strangers. And Heather, she had made it worse. On purpose. Because she thought she could. A ding from the speaker brought her back to the present. The captain's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent in about 10 minutes. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened. Cabin crew, prepare the cabin for arrival. Heather sat motionless. Her role in the crew no longer existed, but the word still hit her like an order. She was going to be removed in minutes. No final briefing. No team goodbye. Just a walk down the aisle, with every eye watching her, every whisper following her steps, and no way to hide from the truth. She had boarded this flight as someone in control. She was going to leave it as someone who had lost everything. The plane began to dip gently, its descent slow and smooth. But for Heather, it felt like a nosedive. The seatbelt sign blinked on again with a soft chime, and a robotic voice reminded everyone to return their seats and trays to upright positions. Passengers complied like usual, fastening belts, closing their books, stowing headphones. But the usual chatter, the mild buzz of tired travelers getting ready to land, it wasn't there. The cabin was still, unnaturally quiet, like the whole aircraft was holding its breath. Heather sat locked in place, her belt already fastened tight around her waist. Her back was stiff, her stomach twisted with a nausea that had nothing to do with turbulence. She kept her head low, staring at the floor, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Every sound around her, the clicks, the shifting, the soft rattle of a snack wrapper, sounded sharper. She knew it was almost over, and yet, in that tiny, echoing corner of her mind, she still hoped maybe this could be fixed. Maybe if she apologized again, maybe if she explained herself, maybe if Richard Carter hadn't meant every word. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't just another mistake like a spilled drink or a boarding error. This wasn't something a quick apology and a formal write-up could undo. This wasn't even about her anymore. It was about the message the company wanted to send, and she was the message. At the front of the cabin, Brandon and Ava remained still. The soft light of the window illuminated their faces, calm but unreadable. Brandon had his arms crossed loosely, his gaze steady. Ava looked out the window, the gift box still sitting in her lap, untouched since takeoff. Neither had said much during the descent. They didn't need to. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone knew why the plane had been delayed, and everyone knew who had caused it. Across the aisle, the older woman from earlier adjusted her glasses and looked over at Ava. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Ava gave a small nod. "Yeah, just ready to be off." The woman nodded in return. "You two handled that with more grace than most adults I've ever seen." Brandon looked at her and gave a polite, tired smile. "Thank you." A few rows back, a man leaned forward and whispered, "They're saying corporate security is at the gate, like actual executives. I saw someone in a suit walk into the jet bridge before we pushed back." His seatmate whispered back, "You think it's real? That she's getting fired, like, right there? Why else would they delay the flight and announce it over the speaker?" Whispers like that floated through the rows. They weren't loud, but they didn't have to be. The tension did the talking. From the cockpit, Captain Lawrence watched the runway lights appear through the windshield. His expression was neutral, but the way his jaw was set showed just how serious he took what had happened. He had seen a lot during his years of flying: weather emergencies, unruly passengers, medical landings. But this was different. This was personal, and not just for the Carters. It was about accountability, about how quickly things can change when power is used the wrong way. He didn't need Richard Carter to explain it. The man's voice over the intercom had said everything already. Back in the galley, Claire stood with her hands behind her back, ready for landing. She looked over at Heather, who hadn't moved in nearly an hour. Her face was pale, her shoulders stiff. The authority she once carried, gone. Her uniform still clung to her frame, but it had lost its power. It was just fabric now. No badge, no name, no role. Claire didn't say anything. She simply nodded once, more out of obligation than kindness, then turned away. Heather could barely lift her head. The pilot's voice returned one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed safely. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. We thank you for flying with us today." The soft thud of the landing gear and the slow deceleration on the runway did little to calm Heather's nerves. Her body felt heavy, like she had aged 10 years in one flight. And when the plane finally came to a stop at the gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off, she didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind raced through 1,000 ideas, desperate for an answer, a solution, an escape. But there was none. Because through the small window near row 2, she could see them now. Standing at the gate, a line of sharp suits, 2 men in black coats, 1 woman with a tablet in hand, and at the center of them all, Richard Carter, tall, still, calm, waiting. No anger on his face, no emotion at all, just cold, quiet purpose. And standing to his left, 2 airport security officers, not just watching, escorting. Heather's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers gripped the edge of the seat as her eyes locked on the open doorway ahead. The passengers were standing now, collecting their bags. Some moved quickly, wanting to escape the awkwardness. Others lingered, watching, waiting. She realized with a fresh wave of dread that they weren't rushing to leave the plane. They were waiting to see what happened to her, waiting to see what the Carter family would do next, waiting to see justice happen before their very eyes. The cabin filled with the familiar chaos of landing, overhead bins opening, bags being pulled down, jackets tossed over shoulders, but underneath it all a thick layer of tension remained untouched. No one was talking loudly, no one was rushing the aisle. They were watching, quietly, curiously, as if they were all waiting for something that had nothing to do with catching a connecting flight or getting home. Every eye, whether directly or in secret glances, shifted toward the front and then to the rear of the cabin, where Heather sat unmoving, frozen in the jump seat like a discarded relic. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Her hands lay on her lap, clenched tight, nails pressing into her palms. The seat she had occupied proudly for years now felt like a prison cell. Every breath hurt. Her throat was dry. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so trapped. She looked forward, and through the narrow space between the bodies of disembarking passengers, she saw him, Richard Carter, standing just outside the plane's door. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, perfectly pressed. His stance was relaxed but precise. His hands were folded in front of him, but it was clear. He wasn't waiting. He was watching, supervising. Heather's stomach turned as she noticed the two uniformed officers standing just behind him. They weren't talking. They weren't moving. Just waiting for one thing. Her. A passenger walked by and glanced down at her with wide eyes. No words were exchanged, but the expression said everything. You're the one. You're the reason this flight stopped. Heather had always believed she was untouchable. Her years of service, her clean record, her confidence in managing difficult passengers. She had prided herself on being firm, in control, respected. But all of that had shattered the moment she'd let her assumptions guide her actions. The moment she looked at two teenagers and saw a problem, without cause, without pause. Now she wasn't just another flight attendant under review. She was the story. She was the example. Up front, Brandon and Ava remained seated. They hadn't stood up with the others. Brandon's posture was straight, calm, composed, while Ava cradled the gift box in her lap, her hands resting gently on top. She looked toward the door, where their uncle stood waiting. Her face was unreadable, not angry, not smug, just quiet. There was no victory in her eyes, only the weight of what had happened. Passengers kept moving, the line inching toward the exit. As they passed Brandon and Ava, some paused for a moment. A nod, a soft word, a simple look of apology. It wasn't much, but it was something. A recognition that silence had made them complicit earlier. That watching without speaking had been a choice too. Brandon acknowledged each gesture with a calm glance, but said little. The only moment he shifted was when a man, maybe in his 40s, leaned down slightly and whispered, "You kept your head when most people would have lost it. That means something." Brandon simply nodded. "Thank you." As the line cleared, Claire approached the siblings. "You're free to exit now," she said softly. "But Mr. Carter asked that you wait until the crew finishes. He wants to speak to you personally." Ava blinked. "Is it about her?" Claire nodded slowly. "About everything." They both remained seated. At the back, Heather finally stood. Her legs were stiff, and her knees buckled slightly under her own weight. She reached for her small bag in the storage cabinet, but her hands were shaking so badly she fumbled the zipper. Claire, who had returned to the rear, stepped forward silently and helped open it. Heather looked at her, eyes heavy with something between shame and fear. Are they really going to do it out there like this? Claire didn't answer at first. Then she said quietly, "They already are." Heather's breath trembled as she clutched the bag to her chest. Her heart felt like it might fall out of her body. She had imagined being let go before. Everyone in the airline industry did. A mistake, a cost-cutting wave, a disciplinary warning. But never like this. Never with a crowd watching, never with a line of passengers whispering her name as they stepped into the jet bridge. She took one step forward and stopped. Her mind begged her to turn back, to sit down, to disappear into the wall. But her feet moved anyway. Each step down the aisle was slower than the last. The space she once walked with authority now stretched like a runway of judgment. As she passed row 2, Ava looked up. Heather glanced at her for half a second. Ava didn't flinch, didn't blink. She said nothing. That silence, unshaken, powerful, felt louder than a scream. Heather's face burned. Her shame poured through her skin. She continued forward, finally reaching the front of the aircraft. The remaining crew stood to the side. Richard Carter stepped forward. "Miss Thompson," he said. Calm, formal, icy. She swallowed. "Sir, I didn't—" He raised a hand. "No statements," he said. "No excuses." She nodded, her mouth pressing shut. Then he turned toward the security officers. "Escort her to administration. Her badge has already been revoked. Her uniform will be returned after documentation is complete. Heather opened her mouth, desperate to say something, anything, but no words came. One of the officers gently gestured for her to exit, and just like that, she was walked off the aircraft, not as a crew member, not even as a passenger, but as someone who had lost everything, her position, her respect, her name. The terminal swallowed her, and the rest of the cabin stayed still, watching her final steps into silence. The aircraft door stood wide open now, letting in a breeze of conditioned terminal air that felt strangely colder than the pressurized cabin. Outside, the gate was crowded, not with the usual flow of boarding passengers or families waiting to welcome someone home, but with airline personnel. Uniformed operations managers, corporate security, and staff from human resources stood just beyond the threshold. But all eyes still followed the woman who had just been escorted through it. Heather Thompson, now no longer a flight attendant, just a name in an unfolding corporate scandal. Passengers exiting behind her whispered more freely now. The tension had lifted from their shoulders and shifted into conversation. Some were shocked, others quietly satisfied. A few seemed deeply reflective, unsure what to make of what they'd witnessed. This wasn't a normal landing. This was something they'd remember and possibly talk about for a long time. Inside the plane, Brandon and Ava remained in their seats. Claire approached them with a gentle smile. "Mr. Carter is ready for you now," she said softly. Ava rose first, gripping the box carefully. Brandon followed, standing tall, calm, collected. He placed a hand lightly on Ava's back as they stepped into the aisle. The walk to the door wasn't long, but it felt important, symbolic. Passengers on either side parted slightly, giving them more room than needed. Not one person spoke to them directly now, but the energy had changed entirely. There was no confusion anymore, no suspicion, only silent recognition. As they reached the door, Richard Carter stepped forward. He didn't smile. He didn't extend a hand. But when he saw them, something in his expression softened. His eyes moved from Ava's calm face to Brandon's steady one, then gave a small nod. "You all right?" he asked in a low voice meant only for them. Ava gave a faint nod. Brandon replied simply, "Yes, sir." Richard exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of relief passing through him. "Good," he said. Then he turned slightly and motioned toward the lounge area off to the side. "Let's talk away from the crowd." They walked together, flanked by two staff members who kept a careful distance. Behind them, the passengers continued to exit the plane. But many stole glances toward the group, watching the man who had halted an entire flight with one call, and the two teenagers whose quiet dignity had triggered it all. In a private waiting area enclosed with frosted glass, Richard motioned for them to sit. Once they did, he remained standing for a moment, his hands on the back of a nearby chair. "You handled that better than most grown professionals I've known," he said, voice low and even. "You could have shouted, fought back, escalated, but you didn't." Brandon shrugged slightly. "Wouldn't have helped." Richard nodded. "Maybe not, but I hope what did happen helped more than that would have." Ava finally spoke. Her voice was soft. "Are they really firing her?" Richard's face turned still again. "She's already been terminated. Her record is flagged, and I made it very clear this wasn't a minor incident." Ava looked down. "I don't want her to lose everything." Brandon looked at her but said nothing. Richard studied his niece for a moment, then sat down. "She didn't lose everything because of one mistake," he said carefully. "She lost everything because she made a choice, and then doubled down on it. In public, with passengers watching, with crew present. She wasn't removed for questioning a seat. She was removed because she decided who belonged and who didn't, and she acted like no one would stop her." He paused, then added, "You didn't get her fired. She did that all on her own." Ava nodded slowly, her eyes on the table. Brandon leaned back slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "Will people actually learn from this?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked thoughtful. "Some will, some won't. But the ones who matter? Yes, they will." He stood again, adjusting his cufflinks. "You two did more with silence and patience than most could do with 1,000 words." And I want to thank you for not losing control, for not feeding into what she wanted. You gave us the chance to hold someone accountable without chaos. A knock came at the door. A staff member peeked in. Sir, press is starting to gather near the terminal windows. Security's pushing them back, but... Richard nodded. We're wrapping up. He turned back to Brandon and Ava. We'll have a car waiting outside. A team member will walk you down, and I'll be contacting your parents tonight. Brandon stood. We appreciate everything. Richard met his eyes, and for the first time since stepping off the plane, allowed a small smile. No, Brandon, I appreciate you. He turned, then added, the airline's going to issue a public statement about this. Not a quiet memo. Not an internal review. A real statement. People deserve to know what happens when the ones in charge abuse their position. Ava stood as well, holding the box tightly. Will it have our names in it? No, Richard said gently. Not unless you want it to. But it will make clear who was wrong, and why she's gone. Brandon gave a short nod. That's enough. They stepped out of the glass-walled room together, their footsteps quiet on the terminal floor. Behind them, the aircraft door had already closed. Cleaning crews would come. Another flight would board. Life would move on. But for Heather Thompson, that door had marked the end. And for everyone else on that plane, it had opened something much bigger. A moment they wouldn't forget. Outside the terminal doors, the world looked the same. Cars pulling up, horns honking, luggage wheels rumbling across pavement. But for Ava and Brandon, it all felt different now. A black town car waited by the curb, its back door already open, a quiet driver standing beside it. The staff member who had escorted them gave a respectful nod before stepping away, leaving the two siblings alone for the first time since they stepped off the plane. Ava exhaled slowly, her grip on the gold-wrapped gift loosening as they settled into the back seat. She stared out the window for a long moment as the vehicle pulled away from the terminal. Do you think this will follow us? She asked softly, not turning to face Brandon. I mean, are people going to say we ruined her life? Brandon didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, his voice calm when he finally spoke. They might, but they'd be wrong. He turned his head slightly. We didn't raise our voices. We didn't threaten anyone. You sent one message, I stayed in my seat. She ruined her own life. Ava gave a slight nod, but her expression remained unsettled. I didn't want it to go that far. I know, he replied, but it had to. The car cruised through airport roads, merging into the city traffic beyond. Inside, the silence between them was thoughtful, not tense. Just two young people who had been forced to grow up faster than they expected, just because someone couldn't see them for who they were. Meanwhile, back inside the terminal, Heather sat in a locked private conference room in the airline's administrative wing. Her personal belongings sat in a plastic bag beside her. Her uniform jacket folded neatly on the table. Her badge was already gone. Her company email shut down. Her name had been removed from the internal system before her feet had even touched the terminal floor. She stared at the blank wall in front of her, unable to speak, unable to process the speed at which her life had come undone. 2 hours earlier, she had been greeting first-class passengers like any other day. Now, she was sitting in a cold room with no job, no future in the airline industry, and a record that would follow her forever. A knock came at the door. A staff member entered with a clipboard. We need you to sign this, he said, setting the document down. It confirms your termination and documents that you're surrendering all company property. Heather looked at the paper without moving. Her eyes were hollow. Her voice was almost a whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The man didn't respond. He just pointed to the signature line and waited. Heather's hand trembled as she picked up the pen. I've been with this company for 13 years, she muttered. I trained people. I managed cabins. I worked overnight flights in storms. And now I'm being erased for one thing. The staff member raised an eyebrow. One thing. His voice wasn't sharp, but it wasn't sympathetic either. Heather froze. He continued. It wasn't one thing. It was the way you acted, the way you looked at them, the way you spoke to them, the fact that you didn't stop even after being proven wrong, and the fact that you only cared once someone powerful got involved. He pushed the clipboard forward. You weren't erased. You exposed yourself. Heather's eyes filled with tears she hadn't let fall earlier. But she said nothing. She just signed the form, each letter feeling heavier than the last. When she finished, the man collected the clipboard and stood up. You'll be escorted out through the employee exit. Someone will walk you to a private pickup area. I suggest you use it. Heather looked up, startled. Why? Because there's already a news crew outside the main terminal. Her heart dropped. They got wind of what happened, he added. They're asking questions about the flight where the airline owner's niece and nephew were shouted at, and the plane was grounded. Heather closed her eyes. Her name wasn't on the news yet, but it would be. She would become the face of what happens when authority is misused. Not just within the company, but in the public. She'd be in headlines. She'd be on message boards. Her face would be posted beside headlines that told a simplified version of a complicated truth. Flight attendant fired after mistreating executive's family. And it didn't matter if they didn't use her name. Someone always found out. As the staff member walked out, 2 silent security guards entered, ready to escort her through the back halls of the terminal. Heather rose slowly, clutching the bag with her uniform like it could protect her from the eyes that were already watching. But it couldn't. Nothing could. Outside, the black car carrying Brandon and Ava reached the highway. The city skyline appeared in the distance. Brandon leaned back, finally letting the weight of the day settle across his chest. You know what I keep thinking about? He said quietly. She had no idea who we were, but she still treated us like we didn't matter. Ava looked at him. And now? Brandon looked out the window. Now she knows we do. They didn't smile. They didn't cheer. They just watched the world pass by, older, wiser, and forever changed. And behind them, in an airport full of strangers, a message had been left behind. Power doesn't protect you when you use it to push people down. And silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest voice in the room. The black car glided through city traffic with a quiet hum, tinted windows shutting out the chaos of the streets around them. Inside, Brandon leaned his head back, his eyes half closed while Ava stared at the sky through the glass, the gold gift box still resting in her lap. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The weight of everything that had happened still clung to them, and even now, with the plane far behind and the headlines starting to form, they hadn't fully processed the storm they had just walked through. Their phones buzzed in their pockets, texts from family, missed calls, group messages blowing up with questions. Friends had already heard. A relative had seen something on social media. Someone had posted a blurry photo from inside the cabin, a caption reading, "Flight attendant screams at 2 black teens in first class. Turns out they're the CEO's family, plane grounded." Ava finally unlocked her screen. Her notifications were stacked, some from classmates, others from total strangers. She handed the phone to Brandon. "It's already everywhere," she whispered. He glanced at the screen. One message read, "Was that really you guys? The flight in the news?" Another, "Yo, I'm so proud of how you handled that. You made history today." Brandon handed the phone back, his voice steady. "Don't answer anything yet, not until Uncle says what the plan is." Ava nodded, setting the phone down beside her. Meanwhile, back at the airport, a different kind of car was pulling out of a private service exit, this one carrying Heather. She sat in the back alone, the windows unrolled just slightly, her plastic bag of belongings at her side. Her name badge had already been shredded at the admin office. Her uniform, still folded, would be mailed to headquarters for inventory purposes. Her contract had been canceled, her employee portal access blocked. Her career, at least in aviation, was over. She didn't speak to the driver. She didn't cry. She just stared out the window as the airport disappeared behind her, replaced by parking lots and freeway signs, all moving too fast to focus on. Her thoughts spiraled. Maybe she could apply to a smaller airline. Maybe they hadn't heard. Maybe she could lie. Maybe she could say it was a misunderstanding. Maybe. But then she remembered the clipboard, the signature, the flagged record, the message from Richard Carter himself. This wasn't a silent firing. This was a signal to every company connected to the airline. Do not hire her. Heather had believed for years that seniority protected her. That experience earned immunity. That being the one to keep things in order gave her permission to judge quietly, correct loudly, and never question herself. But the silence she had expected from Brandon and Ava had been the most dangerous thing of all. Because they hadn't fought, they hadn't screamed, they had waited. And when their moment came, it wasn't them who delivered the consequence. It was someone more powerful than she'd ever imagined, speaking calmly over an intercom. His words carrying more weight than anything she'd ever said on duty. Now, her name had been wiped from the employee schedule. Her email auto-replied with, "This account no longer exists." Her login badge no longer beeped green. She had vanished from the system, but not from memory. Because passengers had filmed, and passengers had shared, and passengers, for once, were on the side of the ones who had been told to move. In a private boardroom inside the airline's downtown office, Richard Carter stood with two executives and the communications director. The television on the wall played a muted version of the breaking news. Viral video. Airline suspends flight attendant after conflict with CEO's family. A scrolling headline below read, "Plane grounded mid-boarding after discrimination incident." The comms director looked up. "They're calling for a press conference. Some are demanding to know why this wasn't handled privately." Richard's jaw tensed. Because privacy is what enables this behavior. This had to be public. The second executive nodded. "So what now?" Richard crossed his arms. "We issue a statement, but not the usual kind. No vague language, no 'we are aware of the situation' nonsense. A real message." He paused. "We let the public know exactly why she was removed. That this wasn't a policy violation. This was personal bias. And this company doesn't protect that." Silence filled the room for a moment. Then the communications director spoke. "What about Brandon and Ava? Do they want to speak?" "No," Richard said firmly. "They've said what they needed to say by staying calm. The rest, that's our responsibility." Back in the car, Ava finally spoke again, her voice almost inaudible. "Why did she look at us like that? Like she already knew we didn't belong, before we even said anything?" Brandon looked out his window. The sky was a soft gray now, clouds drifting lazily overhead. "I don't know," he said, "but I think she's the one who didn't belong." Ava didn't respond, but her grip on the gift box relaxed just slightly. She turned her face back to the window, her reflection looking older than it had that morning. The car took a quiet turn toward the city as the sun began to dip, casting shadows across the glass. Behind them, a uniform had been folded, a name badge destroyed, and an industry reminded. Power without respect is fragile, and silence, when carried with dignity, can shatter it all. By the time the town car reached the edge of the city, the story had already exploded beyond the airline. News outlets were running it on homepages. Social media platforms were cycling through clips, hashtags, and user reactions. Public figures were chiming in. Activists, influencers, and even a few quiet CEOs had reposted the footage and voiced support. And though the video didn't capture the full incident, the most shared clip was crystal clear. Heather standing over two seated teenagers, her voice raised, her face hard. And the calm way the boy simply said, "We're not moving unless the captain says so." That 6-second moment had become the symbol of restraint, of quiet defiance, of a bigger story that had been playing out silently for decades in places where judgment whispered instead of shouted. Inside the car, Brandon's phone buzzed again, but he didn't check it. He stared straight ahead, arms crossed, his mind heavier than his posture showed. Ava sat quietly beside him, her face turned to the window, watching the buildings pass, her reflection fading in and out of the glass. Her voice broke the silence. "Do you think she's really gone?" Brandon replied, his tone low. "Yes." "But what if she just gets hired somewhere else?" Ava asked. "What if she says she made a mistake and they believe her?" Brandon took a slow breath. "Then we trust that people are paying attention. We trust that the right people won't forget what they saw." He glanced at her. "And we trust that even if they do, she won't forget. Because some lessons don't need to be repeated to be remembered." Meanwhile, in a quiet cafe near the airport, Heather sat in a booth tucked in the corner, hood pulled up over her head, staring into a cup of untouched coffee. The plastic bag with her uniform sat beside her. Her phone lay on the table, dark, face down. She hadn't checked it since being dropped off. She couldn't. She knew what she'd find: the messages, the missed calls, the posts, the commentary, the disbelief, and maybe even the first signs of mockery. She didn't need to see it, she was already living it. Her mind replayed the moment again. Brandon's quiet voice, Ava's wide eyes, the hush that fell over first class after she raised her voice, and worst of all, the sound of her own words, sharp and proud, spoken before she knew who they were. Before she even thought to ask why she was questioning them. She had acted on instinct, not training, not policy. Instinct. And that instinct had betrayed her. A waiter approached and asked gently, "Would you like anything else?" She shook her head without looking up. The man hesitated. "Someone was asking about you earlier. A reporter, I think. He showed a photo and asked the manager if you'd come in." Heather's hands curled under the table. "And?" "We told him no one by that name worked here." He walked away. Heather stared down at her hands. She wanted to vanish. Disappear from the public eye, from the industry, from the story that was no longer hers to control. She had spent so long building a persona of authority, of confidence, of being unshakable. But authority built on the illusion of control couldn't survive public exposure. She wasn't just a flight attendant who'd been fired. She was the flight attendant, the one in that video, the one who told two teens, two passengers with valid tickets, that they didn't belong, and the world had responded. In a different part of town, Richard Carter sat in his office, the city skyline stretching behind him, glass walls catching the last light of day. He stood at a side table, pouring himself a glass of water. Across from him sat two legal advisors, both reviewing the prepared statement that would go out in the morning. He turned to face them. "We're not apologizing for firing her. Let's be clear on that." One of the advisors nodded. "Understood. We're focusing on transparency and zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior." Richard's expression was firm. "And I want her name redacted from the release, but not the action. Let the public judge the situation based on what they saw. Not because she worked here, but because it was wrong." He walked to his desk and tapped a folder lying beside his phone. Inside was a printout of the passenger manifest, the internal incident log, and a photo of Heather, her employee ID clipped to her chest, smiling in the headshot. He slid it aside without opening it. Then he made a call. "Is the car back yet?" "Yes, sir," came the reply. "The kids are upstairs in the lounge, safe and comfortable. They said they're fine." Richard exhaled. "Let them rest. Tomorrow I'll have someone deliver a written apology. Not from me, from the company. They deserve to hear it in writing." "Of course." He hung up and looked out the window again, his reflection blending into the city lights below. Elsewhere, Ava sat on a soft leather couch in the quiet corporate lounge, her legs curled under her, the gift box beside her untouched. Brandon sat nearby, watching muted TV coverage on the wall, footage of the plane taxiing back to the gate, clips of reporters standing outside the terminal. Their faces hadn't been shown, their names hadn't been leaked, but the message was already spreading. Respect is not earned through a uniform, and power is not measured by how loud you speak, but by how you treat those who have none. For the first time all day, Ava smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was quiet, worn, but proud. The next morning arrived not with noise, but with calm. The city was wrapped in the soft hush of early light, streets still wet from the night's rain. Brandon and Ava sat near a tall window in the company's guest suite, looking out at the slow-moving traffic below. They had barely slept, but neither looked tired, only thoughtful, still riding the current of everything that had unfolded the day before. A knock came at the door. A staff member stepped in holding a sleek envelope. "From Mr. Carter," she said gently, placing it on the table. "He asked that you both read it before you leave." Brandon opened it. The letter was short, handwritten in smooth strokes on company stationery. "To Brandon and Ava, you didn't raise your voices, but you spoke louder than anyone could have. You didn't ask for power, but you showed us what it looks like. What happened on that plane was wrong, not just because of who you are, but because of what was taken for granted, your right to be treated with dignity. I want to thank you, not just as your uncle, but as someone who needed reminding that change doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it starts with two people refusing to move. You didn't just ground a flight, you shook an industry awake." With pride, Richard Ava read the letter once more, then folded it carefully and slid it back into the envelope. She looked at Brandon. "Do you think people will actually remember this?" He nodded without hesitation. "They'll remember, not because we were loud, but because the silence hit harder." They checked out of the building and stepped outside into the bright morning. A sleek black car waited for them again, but this time the moment felt different. They weren't being driven away from chaos. They were walking forward, away from a moment that had tried to strip them of dignity, and failed. As the car pulled away, a large screen outside the terminal flashed news footage, still images from the video, bold headlines, and a short quote from the airline's official statement. "We will not tolerate behavior that diminishes the worth of any individual. Respect is not optional, it is policy. No names, no faces, just truth." Across the country, in homes and offices, airports and schools, people watched the story unfold. Some paused, some scrolled past, but some, many, felt something shift. A lesson not shouted, not forced, but shown. Aboard one plane in one cabin, two passengers had held their ground not with anger, but with presence, not with volume, but with calm. And that had been enough to bring the entire flight to a halt, to remove someone from power, and to remind everyone watching that dignity is not something earned by rank or uniform. It is something everyone deserves. And for Heather Thompson, now unemployed, now unseen, it was a reminder that authority without empathy is fragile. For Brandon and Ava, it was proof that strength can be quiet, that justice, when it lands, doesn't need to make a scene. It just needs to arrive. And it did, like a plane that never took off, because two people refused to be moved. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this.